Errol Spence Jr. gets it done. Got 3 belts now as he defeated Spence-Ugas, 10th round stoppage. Later in that fight, there was moments. Ugas had his moment there where it appeared that he had Spence hurt there, and ultimately Spence battled back. And I don't think Spence was as hurt as maybe we thought he was, but at the same time, Ugas had an opportunity there. You can argue maybe the ropes held up Spence in that particular spot, and maybe it could have been ruled a knockdown. But I don't know. It seemed like Spence was okay at the end of the day, and as we saw, Spence just went on through and just started beating on Ugas, just put a pounding on Ugas, just beat Ugas down. He beat him down. I mean, at the end of the day, he beat him down, man down. We saw a man down, and that man down was Spence-Ugas. Ultimately, Ugas battled, but the work rate of Errol Spence was just too much for Spence-Ugas. It was just too much. But now, here's the most important thing. We got a call out. At the end of the fight, we got a call out. Terence Crawford now has called out Errol Spence. Errol Spence called out Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford says, you know what? Let's do it. Let's get it done. Terence Crawford is no longer with Top Rank, so he's a promotional free agent. So at this point, he can get it on without any issues. There's no more sides of the streets. It's no more any of those things. As Terence Crawford said, congratulations. Great fight now. The real fight happens. No more talk. No more side of the street. Let's go. Let's go. And yeah, Terence Crawford obviously, wants Errol Spence. Errol Spence obviously wants Terence Crawford, and at this point, there is nothing that is standing in the way of that particular fight. It is time for that fight to happen. No more sides of the street, no more excuses. It's time for us to get undisputed at 147. You got the 2 best fighters at 147, Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. Look at Spence. Spence came into this fight in tip-top shape. He looked amazing. He looked ripped up. He looked ready to go. Ugas did too. And Ugas is a very good fighter, and Ugas can beat a lot of welterweights. He can beat a lot of people at 147. So credit to Ugas. He had, like I said, he had his moments in this particular fight. He stood toe-to-toe with Errol Spence Jr., but that work rate was just too much, man. That work rate that Spence had in this particular fight where, he was just working over Ugas's body, just working over everything, those combinations, the uppercuts. Ugas's face was all messed up. His eye was ultimately closed. He couldn't see out of the eye, and the doctor stopped the fight, right? And that was it. Errol Spence Jr. now has 3 belts, and there's one more belt that he has to get, and that is the WBO welterweight title, which is held by Terence Crawford. So, again, that is the fight to be made. There have been rumors and reports out here that Terence Crawford was in talks with PBC to possibly, get a deal with PBC, and ultimately, with the deal with PBC, he would ultimately have the fight with Errol Spence Jr. The fight is big. I think it's the best fight that can be made in boxing. It's the best fight, I believe, that can be made in boxing. I'm not sure it's the biggest fight because, Canelo against whoever always seems to be maybe a little bigger. But again, in terms of, that is the best fight. The 2 best welterweights, 2 undefeated welterweights, 2 guys who it's kind of hard to say. Sometimes you say, well, I think Spence will beat him. And then other times you'll say, well, I think Crawford will get the job done. So it's kind of hard to say because Errol Spence, he was impressive tonight. He was impressive tonight. The work rate obviously was impressive, not surprising. It's what he is. It's who he is. None of those things are surprising. He ate a lot of shots from Spence-Ugas, and he just kept on going, kept on ticking, and kept on throwing punches, and ultimately he got it done. To me, and I was excited when this fight was made because it offered the possibility now of Spence getting all 3 belts, and getting the 3 belts, and ultimately the only belt left would be Terence Crawford. So it sets up, a fight between the 2 best welterweights, and it also sets it up it's a big situation now because we're talking undisputed, the best of the best in the division. I mean, all the belts would be on the line. All the belts that are out there, all the belts that are possibly could be had at 147 were out there and would be out there. And it's, man, we got to get this fight. This is a fight that has to happen. This is a fight that needs to be made. Like Terence Crawford said, there's no more sides of the street. There's no more of that talk. That talk is out the window. Crawford is done with Top Rank. He is a promotional free agent. So all the talk of Crawford and Top Rank and any of those issues is a wrap. It's done. We don't have to talk about that no more. Time to make the fight. Now, I know in order for this fight to be made, there had to be some step-aside situation with Spence-Ugas, who won earlier today against Butayev. But and ultimately that has to be figured out. And, if you're Spence-Ugas, are you ready to go to Errol Spence at this point? If you had the opportunity, obviously you being the mandatory, would you go out and would you fight Spence at this point? Are you ready for that particular fight? I mean, what do you do there? Do you step out of the way maybe again and let's just get this on? Let's get this on. It's time. It's time to get this on. 147. It's time for us to figure out who is the best at 147 pounds. Is it Errol Spence? Is it Terence Crawford? And at one point in time, the thought was, because Spence really wasn't calling out Crawford like that. And now, after tonight, he's like, I want Terence Crawford. That's who I want, right? That's who I need, and that's what I want to happen next. So let's hope it happens. Let's hope this happens. Let's hope these two guys, right, in their prime, can make this happen. Because it would be a great fight. And it would be for all the belts, for all the marbles, for everything. It would be everything that you want in the sport of boxing. You want one name being the guy, and you want one name, one face. And you want that one name and one face. Maybe it'll be Spence. Maybe that one name, one face will be Terence Crawford. But that's what you want in this particular sport, and it doesn't happen very often where you have two of the best guys going up against each other. And you could argue in terms of Spence, coming off the accident, and Crawford isn't a young pup. So again, you can make an argument whether or not they're in their primes, but hey, they're still elite fighters. They still are elite. Terence Crawford, 34 years old at this point. So you can argue at 34, he may not be in his prime, but again, still an elite fighter. Both are elite fighters. So let's get these elite fighters together and let's figure out who is the best at 147 pounds. Let's figure that out right now. And let's get it on right now. Both fighters are eager. And again, there's nothing that's standing in the way. In terms of promotional situations. There's nothing standing in the way in terms of promotional situations. Sanctioning bodies, that could be a whole nother story. But in terms of promotional situations, there is nothing standing in the way between these two guys and these two guys getting it on at some point, at some time. It is the biggest fight in the sport of boxing, and it's a fight that needs to be made right here, right now. Let's get it done. So, Errol made it clear at the end of the fight. He said, you know what? Everybody knows who I want next. I want Terence Crawford next. That's the fight I want. That's the fight everybody else wants. Terence Crawford, Terence, I'm coming for your mother bleeping belt. So he made that clear. He's coming for Terence Crawford's belt. He wants that strap. He wants that final strap that would make him undisputed at 147. He wants it, and it needs to happen. Right? I can go on and on and on and on and on about how much it needs to be happening. Right? Here it goes. Here's what he said post-fight after the beating Spence-Ugas. Again, he wants it. Right? Everybody knows who I want next. I want Terence Crawford next. That's the fight that I want. That's the fight everybody else wants. Terence, I'm coming for that mother bleeping belt. So, that's what he wants to happen. And quite frankly, that's what needs to happen. Errol Spence looked sharp tonight. He looked sharp coming off the eye injury, coming off 17 months of inactivity. I mean, he looked sharp. And at one point, you want to say at some point, this accident would catch up to him. At some point, the eye would catch up to him. But this dude just perseveres, and none of these things seem to affect him. None of these things seem to stand in the way. None of these things seem to bother him. He was impressive against Danny Garcia. He handled his business, did what he had to do. And he was even more impressive tonight against Ugas. I mean, Ugas is a very good fighter coming into this fight. He was 6-1 against Southpaws with 3 KOs. And beat Manny Pacquiao. Beat up Manny Pacquiao. So this guy, Ugas is no scrub. He's one of the better welterweights, one of the better fighters at 147. And you could argue that Terence Crawford made him kind of look ordinary. He made him look ordinary. And, Ugas is a counter puncher, but he wasn't countering enough. And just the work rate of Errol Spence just on and the punch variety, going to the body, going to the uppercuts, just beating him up, and beating him down for 10 rounds. And well, at the time, I had a 6-3 at the time of the stoppage. I had a 6-3 Spence. Obviously, it was going to be 7-3 because he was going to win that 10th round where it was stopped. So it was a done deal, pretty much. The fight was a done deal. Ugas at that point had to pretty much look for a Hail Mary, and he just didn't have it in him. He just didn't have it in him tonight. It just, he went up against a guy who was better than him. Errol Spence Jr. is better than your Ugas. Errol Spence Jr. is better than a lot of welterweights. You could argue he may be better than Terence Crawford. We'll see. Maybe we'll see. We'll figure it out. But that is a fight that has to be made. And we'll see if, they can put it all together. Big promotion there. It's a big promotion. And again, there's nothing that's standing in the way. No more sides of the street, which is one of the worst conversations to have in the sport of boxing. But it is a legitimate conversation that has to be had in terms of sides of the street. I mean, we have all these different promotional entities. Unfortunately, they have television contracts which stand in the way of some of these big fights happening. All these entities get in the way, whether you're with DAZN, whether you're with ESPN, whether you're with PBC, Showtime, DAZN, and Top Rank ESPN. And all these things get in the way of making big fights, right? We did get Wilder Fury, which was great. That was great. And that third one was an amazing fight, and a great fight. But more right now, you look at 135, like in Tank and Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney. Now, Devin Haney and Kambosos are going to fight, but Devin Haney did have to sign some deal with Top Rank and Lou DiVella, reportedly, so to make that situation happen. But again, Devin Haney is willing to do what he has to do, go across the pond in Australia, do it twice. He's got to do it twice, according to reports in terms of that contract. So if he beats Kambosos, he's got to do it again in Australia. So that, to me, makes that situation a little scary for him in terms of him being able to get the nod in Australia 2 times, basically, right? He's got to get it done 2 times in Australia, and that's not going to be easy for a lot of reasons. It's not going to be easy. But again, back to this one. Credit to Errol Spence Jr. Everybody wants to doubt this guy in terms of the eye, but you look at him in camp, he looked like he was in dog shape. Errol Spence Jr. looked ripped up and looked like he was in big-time, tip-top shape. They said he had a nutritionist in camp with him for the first time, which helped him be able to lose the weight effectively, helped him to be able to lose the weight the right way, and helped him to be in dog shape and do what he did tonight, which is rip up Ugas' face, and which was beat up Ugas' body, which was ultimately stop Ugas in 10. Now, the doctor came in, they put the fingers up to Ugas in his eye, and obviously Ugas could not see. I'm not mad at the stoppage. Do I think Ugas may have deserved to keep going? Sure, but I'm not mad at the stoppage. I mean, it was clear that Errol Spence was going to win this fight. And look, Ugas may have landed a Hail Mary at some point at some time, but at the end of the day, it became pretty clear, became pretty obvious who was going to win that particular fight. It was at that point in time, at that time of the stoppage. And maybe Ugas didn't have it in him at that point. Maybe he did protest a little bit in terms of, the doctor and trying to get to the doctor to not stop the fight. But I mean, it just became clear as his face kept getting ripped up, as his eyes continued to swell, that he just did not have enough to beat Errol Spence Jr. Man down is what we saw tonight, and we saw a man down in Yordenis Ugas. So you almost saw Errol Spence go down, right? We almost saw them. There was a 6th round where we almost saw him go down. Spence, mouthpiece went out, and, he said, and it appeared, you look at the replay, that, he thought maybe he was trying to get the referee Lawrence Cole, who was very involved in the fight tonight, maybe too involved. I mean, we saw a little bit too much of Lawrence Cole, which is not surprising because we all know the history of Lawrence Cole in Texas and some of the things he's done in the past, some questionable referee decisions, and just some of the things that he's done. But overall, he was just overly involved in this one. I mean, we've seen a little too much of Lawrence Cole in this particular fight. And again, he at that point, Spence thought Cole maybe was going to step in there at that point at that time. Didn't happen. And Ugas got a couple shots on him. Looked like Spence was a little hurt at that point, but he battled back. I mean, I don't know how hurt he truly was because if he was, he recuperated very fast, very quickly, and got back and ultimately did some work in the end of that particular round, which ultimately I gave that round to Ugas. I gave Ugas 3 rounds. Ugas got 3 rounds on my card. Obviously, Spence got the rest. But, and Ugas was competitive early on. He was competitive early on, but the onslaught just went on and on and on. The beatdown went on and on and on. And Ugas ran out of answers for whatever Errol Spence was doing. Ugas, again, is a counterpuncher, right? And he wasn't countering. Spence was doing a lot of work, but Ugas wasn't countering consistently enough where he could be effective and where he could do what he needed to do to win this particular fight. It's just that simple. Errol Spence Jr. was the better fighter. And he's, Errol Spence coming off the 17 months in activity, coming off the situation with the eye injury. Errol was like, look, I don't want tune-ups. I want to go in and fight the best of the best. And to his point, coming off the 15 months, coming off the horrific car accident, which is just only an act of God that he's still here today, coming off that car accident. But coming off that car accident, he went in against Danny Garcia. I mean, that's not a tune-up. That is not a tune-up, right? And then from there, obviously, hurt the eye 17 months later. Well, I'm not getting a tune-up. I don't want a tune-up. I'm going straight into Yordenis Ugas. So he doesn't want to waste time. He doesn't want to waste time. He doesn't want to worry about in terms of he's not wasting time. He wants to get in and do what he has to do and get the big, meaningful fights, get the money fights, get the fights that'll secure his legacy, right? He wants legacy-making fights. And again, a fight with Terence Crawford is a legacy-making fight for Errol Spence Jr. So let's hope that he gets it. Let's hope that they can figure it out. I mean, these guys aren't getting any younger. Spence at 32, Crawford at 34. So youth is not on their side. And often in boxing, unfortunately, we get it where, and Crawford will be 35 in September, but often in boxing, we get the situation where we get fights where guys are past their prime, right? And obviously Mayweather-Pacquiao was an example of that. Both of those fighters, while still top fighters at 147, maybe the top 2 fighters at 147 at the time, but again, those fighters weren't in their prime. And maybe that's why we got the particular fight that we got, where a lot of people weren't satisfied what happened there in terms of the activity, in terms of the excitement in that particular fight. So again, you want obviously these guys to get it on because they're at the top of their sport and they're at the top of the divisions. Their division, the 147. So it's time for that to happen. We look at Errol Spence, and you could argue that this fight right here was his biggest win, the biggest win of his career. I mean, Ugas, again, was a guy Ugas beat Sean Porter. That was the only fight he's lost recently. But there was a questionable situation where it appeared he knocked him down, but that wasn't called a knockdown. Ugas easily could have been awarded that fight. That was a close fight. So we look at Errol Spence, and again, big wins, obviously Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, Kell Brook, one of his biggest wins as well. You could argue, Ugas and Porter, you can figure out who you believe is better. Obviously, when the two went head-to-head, Porter did beat Ugas. So, you could argue that this might have been Spence's biggest win, the biggest win of his career, right? The best fighter that he's fought in his career. You can make that argument that this was the best fighter he's fought, and he dominated Ugas. Because you look at Ugas, and Ugas, 27-5 at this point after the loss, but, Ugas was only loss was in 2019 to Sean Porter. Since then, he was on a 4-fight win streak. You can argue 5-fight win streak because, again, it did appear that he did drop Sean Porter in that last round, which was not ruled a knockdown and which would have gave him the fight. So, Ugas was fighting, at a very high level, obviously dominated Manny Pacquiao. Obviously, it's an older Manny Pacquiao, but dominated him nonetheless because, Manny Pacquiao did beat Keith Thurman. He did beat Keith Thurman. So, again, a big win for Ugas. Took the fight on short notice after Spence bowed out with the eye situation. And look, again, I would love Errol Spence to fight Terence Crawford. But if I can't get it, I wouldn't mind seeing Crawford or Spence end with Keith Thurman. I wouldn't mind seeing that. One time Keith Thurman can sell a fight. He's very good on the mic. He has talent, has ability. Keith Thurman doesn't stink, and I think it would be a big fight. If Spence, let's say Crawford signs a 2-fight deal with PBC. Let's just go on the premise he signs a 2-fight deal with PBC, and those 2 fights are Keith Thurman and then Errol Spence Jr. Would you be mad at that? Obviously, maybe not. But obviously, you want Crawford in with Errol Spence. But if you can't get it, I wouldn't be upset if I got Crawford Thurman. I wouldn't be upset with that. In fact, I would be okay with it. It's, again, not the fight that I want, but a fight I would be okay with. A fight I could live with. A fight that I can deal with. A fight that I'd be happy to see. I'd be okay with that. But, who knows if we'll get it? Who knows if that happens? But I would be okay if Crawford, in theory, signed a 2-fight deal with PBC, and then in the process of signing that 2-fight deal, one of the fights that he has with that 2-fight deal is against Keith Thurman. I would not be upset with that. I'd be happy with that. I'd be okay with that. Now, obviously, clearly, the fight that we all want at 147, the fight that we all need, I believe, the fight that boxing needs. It's a fight. It's a big fight. And boxing doesn't always give us the big fights at the right moments, at the right time. We've seen it numerous times, too many times, to name, where guys have fought when they where later in their careers, it was the fight that we wanted, but it wasn't when we wanted it. And again, the perfect example is Mayweather-Pacquiao. That was a fight that we wanted, but we got it way too late. Should have happened. We look at Joshua and Wilder, Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder. That was a fight. At the time, I believe Wilder came off the win against Luis Ortiz, and then Joshua came off the win against Klitschko. Or maybe been flip-flop. I don't know which order it happened, but anyway, both of those fighters were coming off those wins, and they were big wins. And at the time, right, they were the two big guys in the division, and it would have made perfect sense for Wilder and Joshua to have gotten it on at that moment, at that point in time next. But obviously there was sides of the streets and all that stuff that stood in the way of that particular fight. But it was a fight that would have been great because both fighters were undefeated at the time. And both fighters were, obviously Joshua and Wilder both were the two of the bigger names in the sport, and still are two of the bigger names in the sport. But it was a fight that should have happened. It didn't happen. Now those guys both got losses on their belts. I mean, Joshua has 2, Wilder has 2. So at this point, we may see it, but we won't. Who knows? We could see it at some point. It appears Wilder may be done. Who knows? I don't know. But after those hellacious 3 fights with Tyson Fury, if Wilder decided to step away from the sport of boxing, he wouldn't be wrong. I mean, those were some big time fights, and those were fights that took a lot of punishment in those particular fights, and those fights may have taken a lot out of both fighters in terms of that. And it's kind of like Bo Holyfield and their trilogy, right? 3 big fights between those 3 guys, and ultimately, Holyfield was the one. Even though Bo won 2 out of the 3 fights, Holyfield was the one that had, longevity. He kept going on and on and on, ultimately beat Mike Tyson 2 times, right? And Bo wasn't the same after that. He wasn't the same at all after that particular fight. Those particular fights, those were 3 fights. Those 3 fights with Holyfield, he ultimately went on to fight Andrew Galata, and he wasn't the same. He wasn't the same after those particular fights. So, again, when talking about Wilder, he might not be the same. Fury might not be the same either after that trilogy. So, but again, it goes back to my point. My overall point was Wilder and Joshua. I wish we would have seen that fight at that moment at the time when both of those guys were at, undefeated and coming off, the biggest wins of their career at the time. But again, it didn't happen, and we may never see it. And ultimately, the luster has worn off of the fight because, again, both fighters aren't undefeated any longer. Now, Crawford and Spence, these 2 guys are undefeated. These 2 guys have all the belts, all the straps. So it's like, let's do it, man. Let's do it. Let's do it. There's nothing, right? There may be some mandatories that Spence and even Crawford may have to figure out, but hopefully the sanctioning bodies and everything won't get in the way of us, the fans, getting the biggest fight in boxing, right? Let's make that happen. Let's get that done, and let's not stand in the way of the fans being happy and getting some joy from the sport of boxing. Because again, we all know promoters, sides of the streets, have let us down. I mean, it's crazy that Haney and Garcia and Tank and Teofimo at the time at 135. It's crazy that none of those guys fought each other. It's crazy. It's not surprising, but it's crazy because you had sides of the streets that got in the way of any of those things happening. Now again, we are getting a situation with Haney and Kambosos, which is great. But again, we too often, we all know what happens in the sport. If you follow the sport of boxing and watch the sport of boxing, you know that politics seems to get in the way more often than not. But maybe the tide is changing, right? There's so many, and here's the funny part about boxing. At some point we say, well, boxing is dead, boxing is dying, but it's not. It never will. It has its problems. It has its issues, but it never will end. It will never. It will always have its problems. It will always have its issues, but at the end of the day, it will always survive. It will always survive. And that's just the way the sport goes. That's just the nature of the sport. That's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. It always survives. It always figures something out to give us something. But at the end of the day, it does let us down more often than it needs to be, and it's just unfortunate. But it is what it is, and it's just let's get it on. Let's get it on. Let's get it on. It's time. It's time for these two guys, Terence Crawford, um, Errol Spence Jr. It's time for these guys to get it on, get the fight happening, and let's get it done. And let's determine who would be the best at 147. And again, I was so excited when this fight was made. So excited. And I was rooting for Errol Spence Jr. You know why? For obvious reasons. Because I want to see Spence Crawford. I didn't want anything to get in the way of that. I didn't want nothing to get in the way of that particular fight. Nothing. Just like at the time, I was rooting for Wilder against Luis Ortiz, and I was rooting for Joshua against Klitschko. Because again, I didn't want anything to get in the way of that fight. Ultimately, Andy Ruiz Jr. happened, and ultimately Tyson Fury happened, and ultimately those guys, stood in the way of an undefeated battle between Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua. May never happen, who knows? But it's one of those fights that unfortunately has turned into a mythical matchup, and may be forever a mythical matchup. Which again, that was the great thing about Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. That was a mythical matchup. And, obviously those guys, 50 years old, it didn't matter. It was an exhibition fight. It wasn't real. But at the same time, there was a level of excitement. You also had the pandemic going on. I mean, it was, kind of its height during that point. But it was excitement because, again, you had two guys who were at the top who ultimately there was a possibility they could have fought in the 90s, but it didn't happen, didn't come together. But, I mean, it was like you wanted that fight. I think it was early 2000s, actually. But you wanted that fight to happen, and it never happened. But you got it in terms of them in an exhibition situation at age 50-something, right? But it wasn't when you wanted it, but you got it. You got it nonetheless. And, you're happy to a degree. People were happy. People were excited about those fights. People were excited to see Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. get it on because the funny part is, Tyson dropped some videos and people got excited. He dropped those videos of him training, him, trying to get himself in shape, and people, went crazy. They went crazy and got excited. And, ultimately they wanted it to happen. And people, the pay-per-view, I think, did around over 1 million buys. So people were pretty excited about that situation because it was a mythical matchup. It was a matchup that we wanted, but it was a matchup that we didn't get. So now, Errol Spence Jr. continues on undefeated, continues to dominate, continues to be impressive, continues to just keep going forward, just like Terence Crawford continues to dominate, continues to impress, continues to keep moving forward. So now we have to get those two together. Now PBC, whoever the powers that be, have to make it happen. It's time. It's time. It's time. It's time. There's no more things, no more excuses, nothing standing in the way. Terence Crawford was actually scoring the fight on his Twitter feed. He was scoring the fight, and so he was watching, scoring it, and trying to. He was involved. He was involved in terms of scoring that particular fight and watching that particular fight on his Twitter feed. So you look at Crawford and his Twitter feed. Crawford, Spence round 9, Spence now round 8. He gave Spence round 7. He gave Ugas round 6, Spence round 5, Spence 4, Ugas 3, Spence 2, Ugas 1. So he gave Ugas 3 rounds. Like myself, he gave Ugas 3 rounds. But ultimately, Spence, like we said, just dominated, continued on, and got the job done. He talked about Yorkis Gamboa. Gamboa was in there against Isaac Cruz tonight. And, will this finally be the last time, we'll see Gamboa in the ring? I mean, he's been a guy who's been in with Devin Haney. He's been a guy who's been in with Tank Davis. I mean, we've seen Gamboa just keep being trotted out there. They keep trotting him out there, keep putting him out there. It's time for him to go to bed in terms of fighting. right? He's done. And that's okay. But he is done. He doesn't need to fight ever again. It just is sad to see the guy has nothing left. And that's okay. He has nothing left. And again, you hate to get in the way. He's 40 years old. You hate to get in the way of someone trying to make a couple dollars. You hate to get in the way of Gamboa trying to make a few dollars. You do. But man, it's just at what point, at what time, at what moment will we just stop trotting them out here, right? Isaac Cruz, Devin Haney and I think Tank stopped. I think Tank stopped him in the last round. Devin Haney didn't stop him, and Isaac Cruz did. So Isaac Cruz, maybe it was the most impressive stoppage of Gamboa between Tank and Haney and between those three guys. So credit to Isaac Cruz. But I know after the fight, Ryan Garcia, and during the fight, Ryan Garcia, Oscar De La Hoya, we're calling out Isaac Cruz, and I think it's a great fight for Ryan Garcia, and I think it's obviously a great fight for Isaac Cruz. Some people believe that Isaac Cruz beat Tank Davis on that night. I didn't think so, but it was a close fight. Isaac Cruz now has an opportunity. Maybe Ryan Garcia is the fight next for Cruz. Maybe, maybe not. But please, let's not trot out Gamboa again. It's enough of that. It's enough of him getting beat up, right? It's enough. It was enough. He got beat up from the beginning to the end. And Terence Crawford a few years back fought Gamboa. And according to Terence Crawford, Gamboa has never been the same after their particular fight. So, again, that's Crawford talking. But again, maybe he's right. But Gamboa, how many times do we have to trot this man out? How many times do we have to put him out there to basically get beat up? How many times do we have to see it? It's enough already. We've seen enough. We watched it enough. There's no reason to put him out there against anybody, right? And I know, obviously, it's the way the sport of boxing goes where you put, young guys or prospects out there against guys like Gamboa, guys with a name, right, to help build their resume. But, there's no reason now to put this guy out there against anybody so he can get hurt. Because that's the only thing that would happen to Gamboa at this point. It's the only thing that would happen. The only thing that would happen with him and to him is that he gets hurt. Nothing more, nothing less. You look at Gamboa, his last three fights against not Terence Crawford, were against Tank Davis, right? TKO in the 12th. Devin Haney lost by unanimous decision. And then he got Isaac Cruz, who stopped him in 5. So that's Gamboa. And, again, we don't have to see him no more. Please, Al Heyman. Please, DAZN. Please, anybody. Let's not trot him out here again. The only thing that can happen is that he can get hurt. Again, he might make a few dollars. And, again, you never like to step in the way or stand in the way of anybody making money. You don't want to mess up anybody's ability to make money. But he might have to find a different way to make money if he wants to keep going and live in a happy and a productive life. That's just the only way that can happen because, again, the guy is only going to get hurt if he comes out there again. He's only going to get hurt. That's it. There's nothing more to say. He's only going to get hurt. And we don't want to see anybody get hurt because, again, boxing, you can't play it. It's not a sport that can be played. It's nothing that can be played with. You can't play with boxing. That's just the reality of the situation. So you don't want to see anybody get hurt. And Gamboa, how many times do we have to trot him out there? And, how many times do we have to do this with Gamboa? Ultimately, we keep trotting him out there. He's going to get himself hurt. And he got beat up pretty good tonight by Isaac Cruz. And we don't need to see it again. We don't need to see him again. We don't need to see that again. No more. But yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing Isak Cruz and Ryan Garcia. I think that would be a good fight. I think that would be a fight that I wouldn't mind seeing, right? Going forward, being next. That would be nice. Garcia wasn't all that impressive in his last fight. And, but he does have a name. And again, it's just a travesty that he, Tank, Haney, Teofimo, and all those guys never fought each other. That's just a travesty. But what are you going to do? It's sport. It's boxing. What you going to do? You just live with it. You move on. And you just hope for the best because that's the nature of boxing. So 39,000 in there last tonight out there in Dallas, Texas. Errol Spence at home, at the crib, getting his third belt, getting that WBA strap, right? So it is strap season, apparently. Man down, apparently. So eventually, he wants to get one more belt. And from there, maybe after getting that one more belt for both guys, maybe both of those guys move up to 154 at some point. There's been talk about Crawford going up to 154, and there's been a lot of talk about Spence ultimately at some point going up to 154. Heck, maybe they fight at 154. Who knows? But again, it is the fight that we want. It is the fight that needs to happen. And nothing at this point is standing in the way of that particular thing happening. Maybe it happens at the end of the year. That would be cool. As long as it happens. I mean, I don't care if it happens when. I don't care when, but I would like it to happen in 2022. But again, if it happens, a couple months from now, 3-4 months from now, or as it happens at the end of the year, which is probably more likely, let's just make it happen. Again, let's get the fight that we want to see, and let's make it happen. So, Errol Spence, the activity level of Errol Spence, I mean, he was, just head and shoulders in terms of activity level above your Spence-Ugas, which is not surprising because Ugas is the counterpuncher and Spence is the guy that, has more activity and is known to be the more active fighter, known to throw, punches in bunches. And that's what he did. He threw punches and bunches and just beat up, bruised up, swelled up Ugas. And ultimately the swelling in the eye led to the stoppage, led to the doctor taking a look, and led to the doctor deciding that enough is enough. No more. Let's end it right here, right now. This guy doesn't need to take any more punishment. He's taken enough punishment in this particular fight, and he doesn't need to take any more. And again, I thought, and I would have been okay if the fight would have kept going. I would have been okay if they didn't stop it. But at the same time, I'm not mad at the stoppage. Nah. I don't think anybody is mad about that stoppage. Like Ugas, again, he protested a little bit, but ultimately the right guy, the fight was stopped, and it wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing. Did you really think Ugas could win the fight? Probably not. So I think it's all good, it's all great, and it's time again to put Ugas in the back. It's time to figure out how we can make the fight that we all wanted to see, and that is Spence Crawford. Because at the end of the day, at the end of the fight, Spence called out Crawford. He called him out, made it clear, made it plain, made it obvious that is the fight he wants next. So, again, that is clear. He's not, people are talking about, well, Spence wasn't very eager to take this fight. Well, he made that clear now that he is eager. He is ready, and he wants to get it on with Terence Crawford. He made that abundantly clear. So now, there's nothing else for any of us to say. There's nothing else for no one to say except let's make the fight. Let's make the fight, right? Here we go. Again, just so we're clear, Terence Crawford made it plain, made it obvious what he wants next. Congratulations, great fight. Now the real fight happens. No more talk, no more sides of the street. Let's go. There it is. There it is. And we saw Spence, his post-fight interview. He made that clear. He wants the mother bleeping belt. He made that clear and obvious to all of us. And he wants that final belt, the last belt. And that last belt at 147 is held on by Terence Crawford. So he wants it. So let him have it. Let's get it. Let's hope it happens. Let's hope it gets done at some point, at some time. And, coming into the fight, I thought there was a decent buzz, surrounding Spence-Ugas, especially when fight week started. I mean, I thought there was a decent buzz for this particular fight. I thought people really were interested in seeing this fight. And, we'll see what the pay-per-view numbers are when it's all said and done. Obviously, you would like to see less fights on pay-per-view, but it's obviously probably not going to happen. I mean, we got a lot of pay-per-views coming up. Next week, you got Fury and Dillian White, another pay-per-view, right? So you're going to determine whether you're going to pay for that. Obviously, you got Canelo coming up, another pay-per-view. So, theory, if I think Dillian White and Fury is $70. I think if you don't have DAZN, I think it's also $70 for Canelo and Bivol. So if you paid $75 tonight, almost $80 tonight, you're talking about 150, almost $200+ coming out of your pocket to watch some of the biggest fights in the sport of boxing. Now, there's also, we got gas prices going up around the country. We got inflation, food prices are up. So we got a lot of prices that are up right now. And, at some point, at some time, at some moment, people got to start making decisions maybe. And, obviously, it's a luxury to be able to purchase a fight. Maybe now more than ever with all that's going on with the COVID situation and individuals losing their jobs and, the economy not being, the economy kind of being a little topsy-turvy and, again, inflation being what it is and the gas prices going up and going crazy. People got to make decisions and choices. And it's clear, those decisions and choices, I mean, you can't responsibly say if you got to cut a corner somewhere that you can get and buy and purchase a pay-per-view. Now, you can be situations where people come together. You have a little fight party and like 10 people come together and, ultimately 10 times 7, well, then it becomes like $7 a person. Well, that's a little bit more manageable, right? But, so again, the pay-per-views in boxing, it's too many of them. Clearly too many pay-per-views in the sport of boxing. Clearly. There's no getting around it. There's no denying it. There's too many pay-per-views in the sport of boxing. Way too many. And, you got what? And the next month you got Davis and Rolly Romero, another pay-per-view bout. So you got all these pay-per-view bouts. Again, the money is going to pile up. 70 tonight, another 70 next week, 140, right? 80 tonight, I should say, 150. Then you're talking about what? Two something, almost $300 when it's all said and done the next 2 months in terms of pay-per-views. So again, if you want to cut corners somewhere, well, you're obviously not going to watch your pay-per-view. And then, people have become pretty swift and adept at streaming and at pirating and things of that nature. I paid for the fight tonight, so let's be clear about that. But I mean, there's people out here who don't, who stream it and find various sites and various ways to watch the fight illegally, right? So there are people out there who have, especially a lot of these young people, who are adept at doing those type of things, who can maneuver and get around the internet, a lot better than than older people, people like myself. I mean, so yeah. So again, too many pay-per-views, too much money that people are going to have to throw out there to buy these events. And again, if you're a fan of boxing, you have decisions to make. If you love the sport and love boxing, you're going to have to make decisions in terms of what you're going to buy and what you're not going to buy. Well, you might say, well, you know what? Spence-Ugas, okay, I want that one. Fury, Dillian White, I might pass on that one. Canelo, I'm going to take. And then you might say, well, Rolly and Tank, nah, I'm not buying that. So, yeah, you're going to have to make choices. you're going to have to make decisions. And here's a great thing: you got Valdez and Shakur Stevenson, which is going to be on ESPN. It's not going to be a pay-per-view situation. That's great. And then in June, you got Kambosos and Haney, which is not going to be pay-per-view. It's going to be on regular ESPN. That's great as well. So again, you want. I think it's great to get as many fights on. It was great at the time when PBC, was getting those fights on national TV, getting decent fights on national TV, right? We saw what Thurman Porter, unification bout on free TV. That was great. That was great. I think it's always in the best interest of boxing to get as much of the sport on big TV, national TV, where people can watch it and people can see it and become fans of the sport. In the past, a long time ago, boxing used to be on national TV consistently. Obviously, that has changed, and boxing at this point is a niche sport. But again, all these fights on pay-per-view and what we have in terms of our economy and the economic situation that we're seeing in our country, in America, and the inflation and all those things, well, you're going to run out of money. You're not going to be able to, it takes, depending on what kind of vehicle you have, it's going to take a decent amount of money to fill your tank. Now, gas prices are going down at this point, but again, they're still high. They're still high. So again, the point is, at the end of the day, there are a lot of pay-per-view fights out there, and there's just way too many of them. But the beauty and the good thing is, I will say this. Obviously, Spence and Terence Crawford is a pay-per-view fight. That is a legitimate pay-per-view fight. There is no ifs, no ands, no buts. That is a legit pay-per-view fight that would be great if it were to happen, right? Obviously, you wouldn't mind. Well, you may mind because you obviously don't want to spend money on boxing if you don't have to, but you wouldn't mind shelling out a few dollars for that particular fight if you had to do it. You wouldn't mind doing it. And so we look at the official scorecards there from the fight tonight. I mean, it was, again, Spence who dominated. Spence got it done. He was leading 88-82 on one card, 88-83 on another, and then 88-82, all three for the winner by TKO. The man, the myth, the legend, Errol Spence Jr. So, and then, that eighth round, which wasn't a knockdown, but Spence just dominated that particular round. All three judges, two of the three judges, scored the fight 10-8 scored that round, I should say, 10-8 for Errol Spence Jr. And again, the beauty of this is that at the end, first of all, what I wanted to happen, I wanted Errol Spence Jr. to win. Did that. He won impressively. I wanted that to happen. Secondly, what I wanted to happen was, him calling out Spence the way he did, him calling out Crawford the way he did at the end of the fight. Well, he called him out. And again, at this point, 3 belts for Spence, 1 belt for Terence Crawford. So it's time. Undisputed at 147. Undisputed is great because you don't get it often enough in the sport. But anytime you can get an undisputed situation, well, that's exciting. That's exciting. And fans flock to undisputed situations. So you got that now with that opportunity. And not only that, you got 2 undefeated fighters who are 2 undefeated fighters who have all the belts. So, you can't ask for anything more from that. But, Spence, again, in complete control throughout. Ugas had moments. 6th round, he had his moment there. Spence, spit out the mouthpiece there, or he lost the mouthpiece. And at that point, it looked like he wanted Lawrence Cole, the referee, to step in. Cole didn't do it. Ugas got a punch off. Spence laid against the ropes a little bit. Looked like he was hurt, but he was fine because ultimately he came back and got it done near the end of that round. But that was an Ugas round. But Spence came back with some with some flurries near the end of that particular round. So he was good. He was great. But it was a good night for Earl Spence Jr. It was a good night for him, and again, a good night for the sport of boxing for this reason and this reason only. Now we have undefeated Spence and an undefeated Terence Crawford, and now hopefully again Crawford is a promotional free agent. He is no longer with Top Rank, so he is free and clear in terms of his promotional obligations, his contractual obligations with Top Rank. He has nothing there at this point. So for me, it's time. It's time to get, the two best guys at 147, two of the top pound for pound guys in the sport of boxing. I mean, you got all those things working for you. All the belts involved. You got, guys being two of the top pound for pound best in the sport. I mean, you got all those things involved and all those things there. Well, it's time to make time. It's go time. It's time to go. I mean, Spence was very confident in his call out. There was no lack of confidence in that call out. And Terence Crawford, obviously his return, his rebut, he was very confident as well in his call out in terms of wanting to make it happen, in terms of them being no excuses. Terence Crawford, his call out was he wasn't, he ain't backed down clearly. He said what he needed to say, and he wants what he wants. And what he wants is Errol Spence Jr. Congratulations, great fight. Now the real fight happens. No more talk, no more side of the street. Let's go. Let's get it. Let's make it happen. There's no way that it shouldn't happen. These are the two top guys in the sport, and obviously clearly the two top guys at 147. So it only makes sense that these two eventually get it in. It only makes sense. Again, in the past, Top Rank, Crawford was Top Rank, and Spence was PBC, and obviously there's an issue. Top Rank, ESPN, PBC, Showtime, Fox, and maybe not even Fox at this point any longer, because obviously there are no dates in terms of Fox and PBC. There's no dates out there, so it appears that PBC is Showtime, right? It's going to be all the PBC events pretty much going to be on Showtime at this point. But anyway, at that point, a few years ago, even just recently, the only thing standing in the way was the situation involving the two sides of the street, right? Top Rank on one street, the Top Rank Avenue against PBC Way, right? So the sides of the street. And what stood in the way was that. Clearly, if you're ESPN, you want that fight on your platform. Clearly, if you're Showtime, you want the fight on your platform, and so on and so forth. But again, that is now out the way. That is no longer in the way. That is no longer a distraction. That is no longer an issue or problem. That is done. That is done. So there's nothing that stands in the way of it. Nothing. Now at this point, it's the sanctioning bodies and, figuring out in terms of mandatories and things of that nature, what they can do, figure out. I mean, who knows? But they got to figure it out. They got to figure it out. And, one thing about boxing, it doesn't always figure it out the way you want them to figure it out. It just doesn't. So maybe, just maybe, this time around, we'll get the fight between two guys who are still, elite fighters. Crawford, 34, maybe he's not in his prime because of his age, but at the same time, he's still an elite fighter. And Spence coming off the car accident at age 32. Again, maybe not what he was before the accident, but again, still an elite fighter and still one of the best at 147. So again, there's nothing now that can stand in the way. There's nothing else. There's nothing that can stand in the way of us getting what we want and what we need. So I think it's time that Al Heyman and everybody else involved. Let's get it done. Let's get it done. Apparently, Ugas was transported to a hospital nearby there in Fort Worth to get his right eye examined. So he's not going to be at the press conference. Probably not going to be at the press conference, clearly. So he's, going off to a hospital, according to Mike Coppinger of ESPN. Jordanis Ugas is off to a hospital to get that eye examined. The eye that caused the stoppage and caused the doctor to say enough is enough again. So again, Mike Coppinger, according to him, Ugas was transported to John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, to have his right eye examined. The doctor asked him, could he see? The doctor determined that he couldn't see, and the doctor said, enough is enough. Let's stop the fight. Ugas was taking punishment. He was taking punishment, and Spence wasn't stopping. Spence was kept going. There was no slowdown in Errol Spence at that point, that time. He was looking to get it done. And that's the thing about both of these guys, Spence and Crawford. They got that dog in them. Both of those dudes got that dog in them where, they're looking to beat you, but also to beat you up. Those guys got that dog in them. They got that next level, that next gear, which is going to make this excitement. Whose next gear, next level is better? And that's going to be a question that's going to be determined and answered in the ring. To me, if I'm looking at it, I say Crawford, his next level, that next gear that he turns up. He turned up on Sean Porter in that particular fight and got the stoppage. He turned it up, right? He turned it up. He's just nasty. He's just got that dog in him. And Spence does too. Spence has a dog in him too, but Crawford seems just a smidge nastier, right? His bark seems, and his bite seems a smidge more vicious than Errol Spence Jr., but it's not much more. So again, that's the beauty. Like, you have two dudes who can take and go to that next level, that next gear. Two guys who can do it. And so that's another exciting part of that situation, because you have those two guys. You have guys that can go to that next level. You have guys that can take it that extra gear. You have guys who have a lot of dog in them. You have guys who are nasty. You have those two guys. So it makes for a great fight. It makes for a great fight. It makes for a fun fight. It makes for all those things to come together for a good time, for what we want to see, right? Because, again, those guys are big time and are the best. And we got to get it done. We got to get it done. Nothing should stand in the way. Well, yeah, 39,000 fans there tonight. Again, almost 40,000 people in there in Dallas, Texas, supporting their guy, their man, their dude, Errol Spence Jr., showing him love, much love, a lot of love. And again, he enjoyed it, fed off his crowd, and got it done. He fed off his crowd and took it to that next level, that next gear that, again, Ugas didn't have it. Ugas did not have it. Ugas could not take it to that next level, could not take it to that extra gear. And again, because he didn't have it, it cost him. And again, Spence, the activity level of Errol Spence was off the charts, right? Spence and his activity level was huge, right? He kept coming and the work rate was great. His work rate was great, and he wouldn't stop coming. He kept throwing punches, and he was throwing those punches in bunches, right? He kept going and going and going. That dog in him, that dog in Spence, just kept throwing punches and throwing them at an elite and a high level. And obviously they were meaningful punches, and punches that hurt Ugas throughout. Hurt him. Hurt Ugas. Beat that eye up. Closed the eye. Right? Couldn't see. And again, that's a credit to the dominance of Earl Spence Jr. And again, how many times can we doubt this man? How many times, we doubt the man coming off the accident, doubt the man coming off the eye surgery, doubt the man coming off, long layoffs, 15 months for Garcia, 17 months for Ugas. We doubt that. And we say it's, well, and he still comes out looking sharp. I think he was a little bit more, I think he was sharper in this fight than he was against Danny Garcia, but he was sharp. He was sharp. And just kept coming and going, coming and coming and coming and coming. He was sharp. He was the sharp fighter tonight. He was the better fighter tonight. He was the better guy tonight. And now he has all three belts. Not all three belts, but 3 of the 4 belts at 147. So, again, only thing to do is to do what he wanted to do and call out who he wanted to call out after the fight. Called out Terence Crawford and said, you know what? This is what I want. I want Terence Crawford. I want the belt. I want his belt. I want his strap. That's what I want. That's what I need. That's what I have to have. So, let's hope he gets it. Let's hope he gets any and everything that he wants. Let's hope that he gets any and everything that he wants and any and everything that he needs. Because again, this dude is elite at 147. Elite, obviously, clearly. And clearly, Terence Crawford's elite. Look at Ugas. Look at that eye. Look at that right eye. Closed. Swelled up. That eye is closed shut. And that was because of Earl Spence's rights and lefts and the uppercuts and the combinations, the flurries. All that caused Ugas, again, that led to the stoppage. Ugas' eye, the right eye. Ultimately, according to Mike Coppinger, Ugas now is at a hospital in Fort Worth there, getting that eye examined. It doesn't look good, but hopefully there's nothing serious in terms of damage with that eye and nothing serious in terms of him going forward with his career. Again, Ugas can beat a lot of people at 147. He just couldn't beat Errol Spence Jr. He can't beat Errol Spence Jr. But Ugas, he's right there. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Ugas Keith Thurman. I wouldn't mind seeing that. Why not? I wouldn't mind seeing that one. Clearly, I said before, I wouldn't mind seeing Keith Thurman and Terence Crawford. Like, if I can't get Crawford and Spence, well, give me Crawford and Thurman or Spence Thurman. Give me that. I'll take that. I'll be okay with that one. Right? I'll be okay with that. Give me that. Now, with Thurman's, and how he takes punches to the body, I don't know what that's going to look like, but because he's not the best at that, right? We've seen him against Pacquiao, Collazo, right? Where he's had trouble taking it to the body. So, yeah. But again, I mean, if I wouldn't mind seeing one time going in there and fighting a Spence or Terence Crawford if I can't get the fight that I want, which is Spence Crawford or Crawford Spence, however you want to say it. I wouldn't mind getting that one. I'd be okay with that if that's all I can get, right? If I can't get Crawford, I'll be okay with that. Give me that. I'll take it. I'll be all right. I'll live with that. But again, that's not what we want. But again, as we know with boxing, unfortunately, that's sometimes what we get, not necessarily what we want. And this, we need it. Let's get it. Let's make it happen. I mean, Crawford came off a big victory against Sean Porter, right? One of the better welterweights. Porter ultimately retired after that fight. And Spence beat Ugas, again, one of the better welterweights in the sport. So again, there's now, right? Both coming off big wins. Both have all the belts. So both should now fight, right? Let's just fight. Let's fight. Come on. Let's fight. Let's get it on. Let's get it on, as Mills Lane would say. So the late Mills Lane would say. So let's make it happen. Let's make it happen. Let's make it work. Let's get it on, and let's see what happens. Let's see how it all works out with those two in the ring together, Crawford and Spence. So we look at some of the punch stats here. It was clear, based on the work rate of Errol Spence Jr., that he was outlanding and obviously out there. And so Spence outlanded Ugas 216-96, right? So those were the punch stats in terms of Ugas and Spence, and how much Ugas Spence just was just a more active fighter, just a more active guy. Again, not surprising when you consider the styles of these two fighters, but he was clearly more active, throwing more punches, landing more punches, and landing and throwing and just controlling the action in the fight. I mean, not enough in terms of Ugas and his counterpunching. Didn't counterpunch enough. Didn't do enough counterpunching. And again, because he, obviously, as a counterpuncher, you want a guy to throw a lot so you can counter. You want that to happen. You want that. That's what you want. And again, Spence threw 784 punches, right? Landed 216. Ugas threw 541 punches, landed 96. So you're talking about 784, 541, 200 plus difference, 243 in terms of punches thrown. The difference there. Errol Spence threw 243 more punches, landed 120 more punches. So he was clearly the more active guy here tonight in his activity. That work rate is why he is now the IBF, the WBC, and the WBA welterweight champion. And the only thing left to do, the only thing left for him to get, the only thing left for him to grab is that final belt, which is the WBO belt held by Terence Bud Crawford. And again, call-outs were made. Spence made it clear who he wants next. Crawford made it clear who he wants next. So there's so much clarity here. So let's now make it happen. So we're about to get out of here now. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like the channel. Like the video. Subscribe. And we're getting out of here to now. Errol Spence Jr. got it done tonight. Defeated Defeated Ugas by 10th round stoppage, TKO. The doctor stepped in, looked at Ugas' right eye. He said, "Enough is enough." And now Errol Spence Jr. has 3 belts, and the only thing left is that WBO belt. Like, subscribe. See you later. Bye.